Hello everyone and welcome to KWT's Excel training. My name is Barb Coleman and today we'll be talking about sizing columns and rows within Excel. So within Excel you have great flexibility in terms of the size of your columns and your rows, and you want to make sure that you size everything appropriately to fit your data, to make sure that it's legible, that you can read it clearly for whoever you're preparing it for. So some examples for that: if you have long text in a field, you want to be able to make the column wider so that you can see the entire text. You want to be able to adjust multiple columns and rows at once. And there is an auto fit so that you can force the columns and the rows to fit the data that is in each cell. You can also force a specific column or row to be a very specific size manually when you need to as you're preparing your data. So you can control the width of a specific column, the height of a specific row, and the number that you put in when you're doing manual adjustments is the number of characters that will fit. And the default for Excel is 8.43 characters for each column, and that corresponds to 64 pixels. And correspondingly, there's a default value for each row, but you can adjust these as you need to. So we'll take a look at some ways that you can automatically adjust your column widths and row heights, how you can do multiple columns and rows at one time, the manual methods for overriding a specific column or row, as well as taking a look at how you can hide columns and rows, which is the equivalent of giving it a zero width or a zero height. So let's take a look at what some of this might look like. So by default, each of your columns, if I right click on the column heading and go to column width, we'll see the default is 8.43, and that's the number of characters that you can fit in that column. So you can see if I type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, they all fit. As soon as I go to 9, it's slightly overlapping the column width. And similarly on a row, if I right click and go to row height, the default is 15. So as you can see, I have some data in here with my columns set to the default width, and we can see some of these columns are not wide enough to handle all of the data. So the sales rep field has names in it that are longer than the 8.43 characters. So one of the things I can do is I highlight the column, grab the handle at the side of the column, and drag it to make it big enough for all of the data. Of course, if I have a lot of data, I would have to scroll down to confirm that I've made it wide enough for each and every piece of data. If I had somebody with a really long name, I might still not be wide enough. So the other thing we can do is highlight the column, go to the handle and double click. That will automatically format the column to match the data that is in it. So if I go to this item category field, I can do the same thing, go to the handle and double click, and it makes the column exactly the right width to handle the current data that exists. Now, if I start adding additional data that's longer, we may have to make that column wider yet again. But it will make the column wider or narrower depending on the data that is there. So for example, if I had made this column this wide, it's probably too wide. So if I select the column and double click on the right handle, it will narrow it down so that it is a perfect fit for the data that is there. And the other thing we can do is we can grab many columns at once. So if I can grab all these columns, which are currently at the default of 8.43, I can right click somewhere on the header and go to column width. It will show the 8.43 because all of these columns have the same width, but I can override that. I can make it 15 and make all of those columns wider, but I can do it all in one shot. I don't need to do each column individually. Now, if I override one of these columns to be even wider, and now select that group of columns again, they now do not all have the same width. So that when I right click and go to column width, the column width is shown as blank because there's at least 2 different values of width in there. But that's okay. I can still override all of these and bring them all back down to 10. So multiple columns at once. You can automatically adjust columns with the double click, or you can simply override any single column as needed with whatever value you want to plug in. The same thing applies to rows. So if we select a bunch of rows, right click and go to row height, again, we will see what the row height is. Clearly there are different row heights within this selection, and it may be that I, by accident, adjusted one of those rows, but I can bring them all back into alignment by entering one value, and it will make them all the same height. Now, there are times when you want to hide a column. So it may be that I don't need to see this customer number. I can right click and hide. You can see that column E has disappeared, but I'm seeing a double handle here at the top, just to indicate that that column is still there. So we can unhide that to bring it back, but I can also go to column E, column width, and make it 0, and that will effectively do the same thing as hiding the column. The other thing you may want to do occasionally is introduce a narrow column as a divider. So maybe I want the item, the total price, to be separate from the rest of the data. So I could insert a column and I could make it very small just as a separator. And there are times when you may want to add a color to that just to make it clear that that's a separator. Sometimes you may want to do that underneath your column headings. So if I just select that narrow row and add some color to it, it just makes it clear that those are headers as opposed to actual data rows. So that's another option where you might want to introduce some very narrow rows so you can control the width, and it's more about presentation. So when you're building tables for other people to look at, you want them as legible as possible. So feel free to introduce additional blank lines with some color on them to make your data more legible for your audience. So that's a little bit about width of columns and height of rows. Hopefully that's helpful to you to make your data as presentable as possible. Thank you, and that concludes this lesson.